There is a bar in the middle of a city that is already dying. The drinks are still being poured. The jukebox is still running. The neon behind the counter throws warm amber light across the faces of people who don't yet know that the street outside has become something else entirely. And in the corner of that bar, watching the door, is a young woman with a reporter's notebook and the particular stillness of someone who has been listening very carefully for a very long time. Her name is Alyssa Ashcroft, and if she survives the next 72 hours, what she carries out of this city will be the most important thing anyone has ever tried to say about the corporation that built it. The tragedy is that most of the world will refuse to hear her. This video is a deep dive into the complete story of Alyssa Ashcroft, not just as a survivor, but as a specific kind of person whose psychology, professional history, and relationship to institutional silence reveal something about the Resident Evil universe that gets overlooked when we focus only on the monsters and the explosions. We're going to trace her from the investigation that started everything, through the outbreak that changed her life at a cellular level, through the years she spent fighting a battle most people didn't believe was real, all the way to her daughter, walking into the ruins of Raccoon City carrying a weight she was born into without ever agreeing to bear it. By the end, you will understand not just what happened to Alyssa Ashcroft, but what her story says about how horror operates when it wears a corporate letterhead, and why the most terrifying thing about what she documented is that it never actually stopped. The idea to carry through everything that follows is this. Alyssa Ashcroft spent her life planting seeds of truth in ground that the most powerful institution in her world kept salting, and eventually, something grew anyway. If you enjoy this type of video, please leave a comment so the algorithm can help other fans find it. You can also throw out a topic suggestion for a future video. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. Picture 1993. Not the year as a historical abstraction, but as a specific texture of daily life. The weight of a city that has become dependent on a single employer in the way that company towns become dependent, where the logo on the largest building downtown is the same logo on half the research grants at the university, and on several plaques at City Hall commemorating generous civic contributions. Raccoon City, by the time Alyssa Ashcroft had been working as a reporter for the Raccoon Press for long enough to understand the shape of the place, was Umbrella's city in all the ways that mattered. The corporation had embedded itself into the region's economic infrastructure with the thoroughness of something that planned to stay. Money flowed through Umbrella into parks, into institutional renovation projects, into the kind of visible, photogenic generosity that generates favorable press coverage and the assumption of civic good faith. Umbrella looked, from the street level that most people occupy, like a company that had decided to be a good neighbor. Alyssa's job was to look at things from a level other than street level. She was approximately 23 years old when she began pulling at the thread. Her beat was the kind that most journalists avoid, not because the stories aren't important, but because they're slow. They require sustained sourcing, and they generate institutional enemies that newspapers with advertising relationships need to be careful about provoking. Social cases, institutional misconduct, the quiet cruelties that large organizations maintain through paperwork, non-disclosure, and the reliable fact that most people don't have the time or the resources to read everything carefully. Alyssa read everything carefully. What she found, or more precisely, what began to take shape in her notes and her source cultivations, was a private hospital in the Arklay Mountains that appeared to be conducting something the documentation described carefully around rather than directly addressing: illegal drug testing on patients, experiments conducted without consent, funded through channels that, when followed backward through the financial paperwork, pointed toward Umbrella. This was not the kind of story you could write from a desk. It was the kind of story that required someone on the inside. She had a colleague. His name was Kurt, and the record does not give us much more than that. A name, a shared professional relationship, the kind of working trust that develops between two people pursuing a story that neither of them can afford to get wrong. They agreed on a plan that was either very brave or very reckless, depending on where you stand on what investigative journalism demands. Kurt would enter the hospital as a patient. He would document from inside what their external reporting had only been able to approach from the perimeter. This is the moment in Alyssa's story where the lore pivots from professional ambition to personal catastrophe. And it pivots without any of the buildup that the horror genre usually provides. There's no gradual escalation here. Kurt went in. Kurt was killed. The killer was not a guard or a security operative or a corporate enforcer deployed to neutralize an investigative threat. Kurt was killed by a patient. A woman named Dorothy Lester, the wife of the hospital's director, a man named Al Lester. She had been undergoing experimental treatment. The specific nature of that treatment had transformed her into something that could no longer be recognized as the woman Al Lester had married, the woman he had allowed Umbrella's researchers to use because she was dying and he was desperate, and they had offered him the one thing that a desperate person in love cannot turn down: the possibility of a cure. Al Lester had let them into his hospital because he loved his wife. That fact does not absolve him, but it illuminates something important about how institutions like Umbrella find their entry points, how they locate the specific human vulnerabilities that transform otherwise decent people into mechanisms of institutional harm. They found a man who was afraid to lose someone irreplaceable. They offered him the thing fear makes people reach for regardless of the cost. And by the time the cost became fully visible, it was already too late for Kurt, and too late for Dorothy, and too late for Al Lester himself. Even if the specific shape of what too late would look like for him hadn't yet become clear. Alyssa witnessed Kurt's death. The exact details of what she saw inside that hospital in 1993 are not fully elaborated in the available record. What is clear is that she was present, that she saw enough to constitute the most significant eyewitness testimony to Umbrella's experimental program that any journalist would collect until the outbreak itself. What is equally clear is that she came out of that hospital changed in a way she couldn't fully account for, because then, with the clean and terrible efficiency of something that has done this before, her memories of the incident were taken from her. The mechanism of this suppression points toward a man named Greg Mueller, one of Umbrella's chief researchers. His involvement in what happened to Alyssa is documented in the record as an implication rather than a direct confession, but the shape of events that followed makes the connection legible enough. Mueller was connected to the Arklay Mountain Research Network. He had the access and the institutional resources to arrange for whatever happened to the memory Alyssa carried out of that hospital. And what happened to that memory is one of the most quietly devastating acts of violation in the entire Resident Evil canon. The grief remained, the memory of losing Kurt, the emotional fact of that loss, the hollowed-out place it created in her, stayed in her body in the way that grief always does, operating below the threshold of conscious narrative. She knew something terrible had happened. She knew that a colleague she trusted had died, and that his death was connected to a story she had been pursuing, and that the story involved things she could not directly access, but the specific memory that would have allowed her to understand what she was grieving and why, and what it meant, and what it demanded of her. That was gone. What this produced in Alyssa's interior life is worth thinking about carefully. This is a young reporter who is now carrying grief without a story to contain it. The professional engine that should have converted her loss into published testimony, the mechanism of journalism itself, which processes witnessed events into documented record, had been disabled at the source. The event that drove her had been removed from the part of her mind where events become purposeful. She kept working anyway. Chapter 2. The Memory That Wasn't Hers. By 1994, Alyssa was covering the construction of renovations at Raccoon University. Renovations sponsored by Umbrella. In the course of that reporting, she discovered that Greg Mueller had been promoted to lead researcher at the new facility. She documented that detail and moved on, not knowing why that name produced in her the particular quality of professional alertness that it did. Something in the notation she made about Mueller carries the quality of someone writing down a detail they don't yet have a category for. The detail was filed. The connection it might have completed remained invisible. In October of 1996, she covered a heavily decomposed body found on the shores of the Ames River, discovered near the same private hospital in the Arklay Mountains where Kurt had died. Her published article raised the possibility that a corporation was illegally disposing of chemical waste in the river. She named no one directly. Editorial caution required the article to stop short of the accusation her reporting actually supported, but anyone reading between the lines of that piece with knowledge of what she was circling would have recognized the direction she was pointing. By June of 1998, she received a tip about illegal activities at Raccoon Zoo, its director implicated in the smuggling of protected plants. Another tributary of the same institutional river she had been mapping for 5 years. She pursued it. She got the story before a rival journalist named Ben Bertolucci could, a competitive detail that carries some dark irony given what both of them would end up surviving that September. Consider the full arc of this period, 1993 to 1998, 5 years of Alyssa Ashcroft working the perimeter of her own story, 5 years of a journalist following a map whose most important location had been erased from her awareness, and still, producing journalism that circled ever closer to the center, the Ames River body, the Mueller promotion, the zoo reporting. Each piece of published work represents a woman using every available tool except the one that would have made the whole picture visible, because that tool had been taken from her. She was building a case from the outside edge of a truth she couldn't directly access. Memory suppression, the clinical phenomenon that what Alyssa experienced seems to most closely approximate, operates through a mechanism that psychology spent significant research effort trying to characterize during the 1980s and 1990s. The dominant framework describes how the mind manages certain categories of overwhelming experience by dissociating them from the networks of conscious recall. The memory doesn't vanish. It persists, encoded in the body's stress responses, in the emotional residue that shapes behavior without announcing its origins, in the implicit learning systems that process pattern and threat independently of narrative memory. What becomes inaccessible is the explicit account, the story you would tell if asked what happened, the event as an experience you can narrate to yourself and others. What remains is the shape of the event's consequences, the grief, the professional alertness when certain names appeared, the particular quality of attention she brought to anything connected to the Arklay Mountains. These were the event's fingerprints on a consciousness that had been stripped of the event itself. Umbrella's approach to Alyssa, suppression rather than elimination, was a calculated institutional decision. A dead journalist generates investigations. A traumatized journalist who cannot fully account for her own behavior, who pursues stories that circle obsessively around an event she cannot remember, who produces circumstantial reporting that approaches accusation without achieving it. This person is useful to the institution in a specific way. She constitutes visible evidence that the story is being worked by someone who can't quite find it. She serves as a kind of controlled burn on the investigative landscape, consuming journalistic attention in ways that never resolve into the direct documentation that would threaten Umbrella's position. This calculation was sophisticated. It was also profoundly arrogant, because it assumed that what had been suppressed could remain suppressed indefinitely, that the journalist who kept circling the story would never find her way back to the event at its center, that the blank space on the map would remain blank. It underestimated what would happen if the events connected to that blank space collapsed from history into the present. By September of 1998, Raccoon City was approaching crisis. The T-virus had been spreading through the city's underground infrastructure for weeks, moving through the water system and the sewer networks in ways that the surface-level city didn't yet understand. The visible city, the one going about its late summer business, the one with bars and restaurants and a university, and a zoo and a reporter for the Raccoon Press following up on tips about corporate misconduct, was already carrying the infection without knowing it. Alyssa was in the city. She was there on a Tuesday evening, the 23rd of September, following a story that had led her to Jay's bar. She was watching the door the way she always watched doors, trained on the quiet, professional certainty that whatever came through it next was worth documenting. What came through it was the beginning of the end of everything she had spent 5 years trying to expose, arriving not as testimony or evidence or a source willing to talk, but as the undeniable physical proof of what happens when the experiments hidden in the mountains are finally, catastrophically, allowed to reach the population that never consented to being adjacent to them. The outbreak was here, and before it was over, Alyssa Ashcroft was going to walk back into the hospital where this all began. She was going to stand in the place where Kurt died, and the wall that Umbrella had built inside her memory was going to come down. What she found on the other side of that wall, and what she did with it for the next 20 years, is the part of her story that demands to be told. Chapter 3. Night at Jay's Bar, September 23rd, 1998. The bar is still warm. The drinks are still being poured. Outside on the streets of Raccoon City, the infection has already moved past the point where containment is possible, spreading through the underground channels of a city that never knew what was living beneath it. The T-virus doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with sirens or emergency broadcasts, or the kind of visible warning that gives people time to make decisions. It arrives as a neighbor who looks slightly wrong, as a sound in the alley that doesn't resolve into anything recognizable, as a bartender who stops responding to the question someone just asked him because he's already somewhere else now, somewhere past the threshold of what medicine or compassion or a locked door can address. The bartender's name was Will. He was attacked inside Jay's bar that night, and the moment it happened, the bar stopped being a bar and became the first survival environment of Alyssa Ashcroft's next 72 hours. There were 8 people in that building when the outbreak reached them. Kevin Ryman, a Raccoon Police Department officer who had failed his STARS selection test and carried that failure with the particular weight of someone who measures himself by institutional standards. Mark Wilkins, a security guard and Vietnam veteran, who understood violence at a level the others didn't, and carried that understanding with a quietness that made it more rather than less present. Jim Chapman, a subway worker who knew the underground infrastructure of the city better than almost anyone alive, a fact that would matter repeatedly over the days ahead. George Hamilton, a physician whose training would make him one of the most genuinely useful people in any group trying to survive a biological disaster. David King, a plumber whose practical mechanical relationship to physical environments gave him tools, literal and otherwise, that soldiers and researchers and journalists didn't have. Yoko Suzuki, a student carrying a secret that none of the others yet understood, her connection to the events in the Arklay Mountains running deeper than anyone in that bar knew. Cindy Lennox, a waitress who had been working her shift when the city's infrastructure of normalcy began to come apart. And Alyssa. Look at this group as a deliberate statement about what survival looks like in a world built by Umbrella. No STARS operatives, no government agents, no one wearing the organizational armor of an institution large enough to have prepared them for biological disaster. A cop, a veteran, a subway worker, a doctor, a plumber, a student, a waitress, and a journalist, the connective tissue of a functioning city, the people who keep things running without being allowed inside the decisions that determine what those things are actually running toward. These 8 people survived the opening night of the Raccoon City outbreak together, and then the city forced them through a series of scenarios, that the record documents as the core events of Alyssa's survival story. What matters for understanding Alyssa specifically is not just what happened, but how she moved through it, what skills she brought, what she was doing with her professional instincts in the middle of conditions designed to make professional instincts feel irrelevant. The first thing to understand is her particular capabilities during the outbreak. Alyssa could pick locks. This is documented as one of her defining practical skills, the ability to access areas that other survivors couldn't reach because the standard routes were blocked, to move through buildings along lines that weren't the obvious lines, to find the back door when the front was impossible. This is not an incidental detail. This is the physical expression of the professional training that defines her entire relationship to information. A journalist who covers institutional misconduct learns to find ways into spaces that institutions prefer to keep closed. She reads a building the way she reads a document, looking for what's being hidden behind what's being shown, identifying the entry point that exists even when the official entrance is locked. This capability meant that throughout the outbreak, Alyssa's route through the city's survival environments was never purely reactive. She was always looking for the next opening, the next unlocked truth, the next piece of the building that would let her move forward instead of being held in place by whatever obstacle had been put in her way. The second thing to understand is that she was taking notes. This sounds almost absurd in the context of what she was moving through, but the journalistic instinct, the professional reflex of observation, documentation, the continuous low-level process of converting experience into record, doesn't switch off in a crisis. If anything, it intensifies. Because every zombie shambling through those streets was a former person whose death was traceable to choices made in boardrooms and research facilities that the public had never been allowed inside. Every blocked corridor, every burning building, every infected creature she encountered was evidence of something. Alyssa knew at some level that she was inside the most important story of her career, and whatever remained of her professional self continued functioning even under conditions that would have justified pure self-preservation. Keep that quality in mind as we move through the specific events she survived, because the notes she kept during those days, the observations she accumulated, the record she was building even while fighting for her life, all of it would matter enormously once she got out. The group's trajectory through Raccoon City carried them through environments that each presented their own specific shape of institutional horror. The police department, a civic institution whose actual function had been compromised by the same corporate relationships that compromised everything else in the city. The zoo, where Alyssa had been reporting on corporate misconduct just weeks earlier, now transformed into a survival environment where creatures that should never have been in proximity to civilians were loose in ways that the zoo's director had helped arrange. The university where Greg Muller, the name that had appeared in her notes since 1994, had been elevated to a position of institutional authority by the corporation now responsible for everything burning around her. Each location was a different angle on the same story. Each one added another piece to the evidentiary case she had been building for 5 years, without the central memory that would allow her to understand what the case was actually about. That central memory was waiting for her in the Arklay Mountains. She didn't know it yet. Chapter 4: Hellfire and the Architecture of Survival. The Apple Inn was on fire. 2 firemen named Len and Charlie were already dead by the time the survivors of Jay's bar fully understood what the Hellfire scenario was going to demand of them. A boiler explosion had set the building alight from below, and the structure was doing what burning structures do, becoming unreliable in the ways that matter most when you need to trust the floor beneath your feet and the ceiling above your head. The Apple Inn was an environment where the threat wasn't just the infected moving through its corridors. The building itself had become adversarial. The fire was consuming the evidence of what had been there, transforming rooms and hallways into spaces that would not be recognizable by the time the smoke cleared. There is something almost too precise about the image of a journalist trapped inside a burning building, the fire that destroys the record, the evidence consumed before it can be documented, the physical embodiment of everything that institutions deploy against the people trying to hold them accountable. Not direct confrontation, but the removal of the conditions that make accountability possible. But Alyssa moved through the Apple Inn, not as a symbol, but as a person. And the distinction matters enormously, because horror that treats characters as embodied ideas tends to feel hollow in ways that horror treating them as specific individuals with specific histories never does. What the Apple Inn demanded was a particular kind of cognitive endurance. The fire created constant environmental change. Routes that had been passable minutes earlier became impassable. As the structure shifted, exits that seemed viable from one angle were blocked when approached directly. The building's internal logic deteriorating in real time. Navigating this required the same adaptive reading of space that Alyssa had been doing her entire professional life, but accelerated into a timescale where the cost of misreading was immediate and physical. This is worth pausing on. Survival under acute crisis conditions is not primarily a test of physical capability. Though the physical demands were severe, it is a cognitive test. The ability to maintain coherent decision-making in an environment specifically designed by its circumstances to make coherent decision-making feel impossible. The field of stress decision research has documented the way that trained responders maintain function under these conditions through what researchers describe as procedural automaticity, falling back on deeply rehearsed sequences that free up cognitive resources for the adaptive demands that novel situations always present. What Alyssa had was not combat training or emergency response training. What she had was something that turns out to be remarkably transferable: the professional practice of staying oriented in confusing environments, remaining calm enough to observe accurately while under pressure, reading the space she was in for information rather than reacting to its surface appearances. A journalist who has spent years covering institutional misconduct has practiced, in a very specific way, the cognitive architecture that crisis survival demands. You learn not to panic when the official account doesn't match the evidence. You learn to maintain your analytical frame when the environment is actively attempting to confuse you. You learn that the most important information is usually the information that the environment is working hardest to prevent you from accessing. These habits of mind translate, imperfectly but meaningfully, into the ability to keep your head when a building is on fire and the people around you are making increasingly panicked decisions. The liquor encounters in the Apple Inn presented a different quality of threat than the standard infected. Not the shambling, infectious former people that the T-virus produced in its most visible form, but something engineered at a deeper level of biological modification, moving with a speed and precision that made the survival calculus entirely different. Alyssa had no military training. Her ability to navigate these encounters depended on the same environmental reading that had carried her through the rest of the outbreak, staying oriented, finding the back route, using the building structure rather than confronting the threat directly. The lock-picking capability that defined her practical toolkit in the outbreak was the difference between routes that were possible and routes that weren't. She made it through. The pattern repeating across all of the scenarios Alyssa moved through during those 72 hours is worth identifying explicitly, because it says something that will matter later. She was not the strongest person in the group. She was not the most physically formidable, not the most combat experience, not the one most prepared by prior training for the specific nature of what Raccoon City's outbreak presented. What she was, consistently, was oriented. She always knew where she was relative to where she needed to be. She always read the environment for its hidden information before committing to a route. She always kept the record of what she was seeing, even when keeping records felt like an absurd luxury. These are journalist qualities. Transposed into a survival context, they produced a survivor who moved with a specific kind of purpose, not the aggression of someone trained for violence, not the clinical calculation of a physician like George Hamilton, applying medical knowledge to biological threats, but the quiet, determined forward motion of someone who understands that the story doesn't wait, and that getting out is not just a matter of personal survival, but a matter of professional obligation to everything she was carrying. The group eventually made their way toward the Arklay Mountains. Al Lester, the hospital director whose experimental collaboration with Umbrella had produced the event at the origin of everything, appeared from his cabin in the mountain outskirts and claimed to know a route through his old workplace. His wife Dorothy's transformed body had been growing through the structure of the abandoned hospital since 1993, a biological consequence of the experiments that had consumed her. The building itself becoming a kind of memorial to what Umbrella's research produced when it was left unchecked. Al Lester was a broken man. He was also the only person standing at the threshold of the place where Alyssa's suppressed memory was stored. She followed him toward the hospital, and still, standing outside it, she did not recognize it. The suppression held. For now. Chapter 5. The Flashback. The suppression held all the way to the threshold, walking toward the abandoned hospital in the Arklay Mountains, with Al Lester moving ahead of her. Alyssa processed the building as another survival environment, another contaminated space to navigate, another structure full of things that Umbrella had left behind when the experiments there became impossible to continue in proximity to a city that was still asking questions. She read its exterior the way she read every building she entered during those days, for roots, for vulnerabilities, for the information the structure itself was trying to communicate. And then she stepped inside. The recovery of suppressed traumatic memory under conditions connected to the original event is a phenomenon that clinical literature has examined with genuine difficulty, because the mechanism doesn't operate through ordinary recollection. The brain's encoding of overwhelming experience is not uniform. Episodic memory, the kind that produces narratable accounts, the kind you can retrieve in sequence and describe to another person, is encoded differently from implicit memory, the kind that operates in the body's responses, in the physiological patterns of stress and recognition that run beneath conscious awareness. When the original event involves trauma severe enough to disrupt ordinary encoding, the episodic record can be severed from its own emotional and sensory components. What remains is the body's response, the stress signature, the recognition pattern, without the narrative that would explain it. Walking back into the specific sensory environment where the original experience occurred can be understood as a kind of forced reconnection. The body's pattern recognition systems encounter the stimulus that produced the original response and begin firing in the same configuration they fired in then. The smell of the building, the quality of the light through specific windows, the particular acoustic character of those corridors. The body is already responding as it responded in 1993 before the conscious mind has caught up with why. And then the why arrives. The memories broke through inside that hospital. 1993, Kurt, the investigation, Dorothy Lester, the moment of witnessing that had been sealed away before her mind had the chance to process it into something she could carry consciously. 5 years of grief without a story to contain it suddenly collapsed back into a grief that had a name and a face, and a specific location, and the entire accumulated weight of every day she had spent working around the blank space it left without knowing why the blank space existed. The horror of that moment is not the supernatural horror of what the hospital contained. It is the interior horror of a person who has been living in a house with a sealed room for 5 years and has finally opened the door. Everything that was inside was always there. The grief was always real. The loss was always specific. The professional obsession that kept her circling the Arklay Mountain story was always pointing here. None of it was irrational or confusing or fragmented. It was all of a piece, all coherent, all connected, and the only thing that had made it feel incoherent was the act of institutional violence that removed the narrative center and left her living around its absence. Greg Muller had suppressed the memory. Whatever method was used, and the lore record implies rather than fully documents his specific role, the outcome was 5 years of a journalist carrying grief she couldn't properly mourn, pursuing a story she couldn't properly tell, and building a circumstantial evidentiary record that circled the truth without being able to land on it. Because the landing point was the one thing that had been taken. Now she had it back. Al Lester was present, the man who had let Umbrella into his hospital, who had traded his patient's consent for his wife's potential survival, was standing in the building where that trade had been carried out. The record doesn't elaborate on what passed between them in detail. What it establishes is the larger shape of confrontation. A woman who had just recovered the full memory of what this man's choices had cost, standing in the physical location of that cost, while the biological consequence of those choices continued growing through the building around them. Dorothy Lester had become something that had integrated itself into the structure of the hospital over 5 years. The abandoned building was not simply a building, it was a biological document. The physical record of what Umbrella's experimental program had produced when left to develop unchecked through the decay of an unsupervised facility. The survivors fought through it. They confronted what had become of Dorothy. They escaped as the structure came apart around them. Alyssa came out of that hospital carrying two things simultaneously: the memories she had recovered, which meant the full evidential account of what had happened in 1993, the illegal drug testing, the experiments on patients without consent, Kurt's death, the Umbrella connection, all of it restored to the part of her mind where it could be shaped into testimony, and the contemporary evidence she had been accumulating across 72 hours of survival. The observations and notes from inside a city-scale biological disaster that was the direct consequence of the research that Arklay Hospital had been conducting. She had, in other words, everything. She had the beginning of the story and the end of the story, both recovered in the same 48-hour window. 5 years of suppression, 5 years of circling, 5 years of building the circumstantial record around an empty center. And now the center was full, and the record was complete, and the city that had contained everything Umbrella had been trying to hide was in the process of being sterilized by the government before a complete evidentiary record could be established by anyone other than her. She needed to get out before the government destroyed the city and destroyed the evidence. She needed to survive long enough to write the story that Umbrella had spent 5 years ensuring she would never be able to tell. She got out before the sterilization operation on October 1st, and she wrote it. That explains why the story had to be suppressed for so long. But it doesn't explain why the world still refused to fully believe it once it was told. The answer to that question is considerably more uncomfortable, because it has nothing to do with Umbrella, and everything to do with the institutions that were supposed to be on the right side of the accountability that Alyssa was demanding. Chapter 6. What the Truth Costs. The article existed, That is the first thing to establish clearly, because in the years that followed, the instinct of the institutions working against Alyssa's testimony would be to make the article feel like it didn't, to make it feel like the confused output of a traumatized woman who had survived something catastrophic and couldn't be trusted to accurately separate what she had witnessed from what her overwhelmed mind had constructed. The article was titled, "What is a BOW? Blowing the lid off this horrifying secret project." Alyssa wrote it with everything she had: the recovered memories of 1993, Kurt, the Arklay Hospital, the illegal experiments, the umbrella funding trail she and Kurt had been following when he went in and didn't come out, the 72 hours of documented survival inside Raccoon City, the observations she had kept through the Apple Inn and the police department and the zoo and the university, the full arc of her 5 years of published circumferential reporting, the Ames River body, the Greg Mueller promotion, the zoo director, all of it now visible as a connected body of evidence rather than a collection of suggestive fragments. She had the most comprehensive first-person account of Umbrella's biological weapons program that any civilian journalist had ever assembled, and she had it documented in the specific professional form that her years of training had prepared her to produce. She published it, and then she waited to see what would happen. What happened is one of the most instructive sequences in the Resident Evil universe, and it receives almost no attention compared to the monsters and the weapons and the dramatic confrontations between operatives and corporate machinery. The article was dismissed as conspiratorial, as the product of a traumatized survivor who had conflated the horror of what she had physically experienced with accusations that couldn't be substantiated in ways that responsible institutions could validate, as the work of someone whose memory of events, including, with devastating irony, the very memories that had been suppressed and recovered, was inherently suspect because of the conditions under which they had been recovered. The recovered memories of the 1993 events became the primary instrument of the attack on her credibility. This is not accidental. The history of institutional cover-up of harm shows a consistent second-phase strategy once direct evidence suppression has been either exhausted or unsuccessful. The management of witness credibility through the exploitation of the circumstances that produce testimony. A journalist who recovered traumatic memories under extreme conditions inside an active biological disaster is, on the surface, an easier target for credibility management than a journalist who simply reports what she witnessed in ordinary circumstances. The circumstances of the recovery, the crisis environment, the personal trauma, the years of apparent amnesia that preceded the recovery. All of these can be reframed through institutional messaging as reasons to doubt rather than as contextual factors that actually explain the evidence accurately. The U.S. government had its own liability in Raccoon City. The sterilization operation, the missile strike that destroyed the city on October 1st, was a government action. The regulatory failures that had allowed Umbrella to operate with the degree of autonomy it had accumulated over decades in the Raccoon City region were government failures. The classified intelligence relationships that may have connected government programs to Umbrella's research existed within government agencies. None of these facts created institutional incentives to validate the journalism that connected all of them. The government's position on Raccoon City required a narrative in which the disaster was contained, explainable, and managed, not a narrative in which a corporation had been conducting illegal human experimentation under regulatory cover for decades, with the complicity of multiple institutional actors. Alyssa's article threatened that narrative directly, and the government had significantly more resources for narrative management than she did for narrative maintenance. The Raccoon trials began and lasted 5 years. The legal proceedings that emerged from the destruction of Raccoon City were the largest omnibus examination of the events leading up to and including the outbreak, and they produced a record that eventually contributed to the collapse of Umbrella USA, the corporate structure that had sheltered the research programs, the funding networks, the institutional relationships that had made everything possible. All of it came apart under the accumulated legal and investigative pressure that the trials generated. That is a real outcome. Alyssa's reporting contributed to it. The survivors' testimonies, including hers, formed part of the evidentiary foundation that the proceedings built on. And still, the specific accusations at the heart of her article, the existence of biological weapons, the deliberate human experimentation, the precise nature of what Umbrella had been doing in facilities connected to the Arklay Mountains and throughout the research network that had contaminated Raccoon City, remained in a gray zone of public credibility throughout and after the trials. The legal proceedings produced corporate accountability without producing public reckoning. Umbrella USA fell. The story Alyssa had written remained filed in the broader cultural conversation, under the category of things that traumatized people claim about events that were terrible enough to generate that level of trauma. The distinction between legal outcome and public belief is one that journalism covering institutional harm encounters repeatedly, and it produces a specific kind of exhaustion in the people who have spent years trying to close the gap between the two. The evidence exists, the testimony exists. The legal proceedings have produced outcomes that, if believed, confirm the accusations, and yet the public narrative hasn't moved to the place the evidence points, because the institutional machinery for managing that public narrative has been more persistent and better resourced than the machinery for correcting it. Alyssa understood this dynamic because she had been living inside it. She had spent 5 years publishing stories that individually were solid and collectively were pointing directly at an indictment of a corporation that most of her city trusted with its economic foundation. She had watched those stories either not land or land softly, absorbed into the same civic inertia that protected Umbrella because Umbrella was useful. The post-Raccoon experience was that dynamic operating at a much larger scale, with higher stakes and more powerful institutional actors aligned against the specific testimony she was offering. What she did with this reality tells us something that is easy to miss if we focus only on the dramatic events of the outbreak itself. She kept working. She raised a daughter named Grace. She continued her journalism. She continued pursuing the stories that the post-Umbrella landscape produced, because the collapse of one corporation doesn't collapse the pattern that corporation instantiated. The methodology of biological weapons development, human experimentation, institutional cover-up, and witness discreditation doesn't disappear when the specific organization that developed it loses its legal standing. It relocates. It finds new corporate vehicles, new institutional partners, new geographic locations far enough from the scrutiny that followed Raccoon City's destruction to continue operating without the liability of that association. Alyssa knew this. She had spent her entire career understanding that the story was always bigger than the specific company filing the articles of incorporation. The terrifying thing about what comes next in her story is that she was right. Chapter 7. The institutions that outlast the evidence. We need to step back from the immediate sequence of Alyssa's life here and look at the structure beneath it. Not the events. The events have been building on each other in ways that carry their own momentum. What needs examining is the architecture of what she was actually documenting across 25 years of professional work, because that architecture is more disturbing than any specific event it produced, and understanding it is essential for understanding why her story doesn't end with the Raccoon trials, and why her daughter is the character who carries it forward. The institutions that generate the kind of harm Alyssa spent her career exposing share certain consistent structural features across the historical record, not just in the Resident Evil universe, but in the documented history of corporate and governmental misconduct in the actual world we live in. The first feature is that they embed themselves economically in the communities they endanger. They become load-bearing elements of local economic infrastructure. Employers, civic donors, institutional partners for universities and hospitals and government agencies in ways that make them difficult to challenge without also challenging the economic foundations that the community depends on. Raccoon City's relationship with Umbrella was a textbook example of this pattern. The corporation was so deeply woven into the city's economic fabric that questioning it required simultaneously questioning the conditions of everyone's employment, the source of university funding, the basis of civic renovation projects, and the relationships between local politicians and their most significant financial patron. This economic embedding creates a perceptual barrier against accountability. People who are economically dependent on an institution tend to resist information that would require them to conclude that the institution is harmful, not necessarily because they are incapable of processing the information, but because the consequences of believing it are genuinely severe. Belief demands action. Action has costs. When the costs of action are distributed unevenly, when the journalist or the whistleblower or the regulatory agency bears the direct costs of confrontation, while the community bears the distributed costs of continued harm, the calculus tends to favor the status quo even when the status quo is actively dangerous. Alyssa's journalism across the entire arc of her career was working against this perceptual barrier. Every story she published placed a piece of documented evidence on the side of belief that the barrier was working against. The Ames River article made the chemical waste disposal visible. The zoo reporting made one more umbrella-adjacent institutional compromise documentable. The Post-Raccoon article placed the full testimony of a direct witness on the public record. None of these individual pieces were sufficient to dismantle the barrier. Together, over 25 years, they constituted a sustained assault on the institutional credibility that the barrier depended on. The second structural feature of these institutions is their relationship to regulatory capture. The process by which the agencies nominally responsible for oversight become, through funding relationships, personnel pipelines, and institutional culture, effectively aligned with the interests of the entities they are supposed to regulate. Umbrella's relationships with government agencies in the Raccoon City period represent a version of this dynamic that the post-Raccoon legal proceedings produced enough documentation to establish. The corporation operated in a regulatory environment it had, in significant ways, shaped. The people who were supposed to be watching were either on Umbrella's payroll in some form, were professionally dependent on Umbrella's continued operation in ways that created incentive to look in other directions, or were structurally positioned in ways that made effective oversight functionally impossible. This matters for Alyssa's story because it explains why the journalism she was producing during the 5 years between the Arklay Hospital incident and the outbreak couldn't gain the institutional traction that would have allowed it to function as conventional accountability journalism. When the regulatory agencies that should have validated her reporting about illegal drug testing and chemical waste disposal and corporate misconduct were themselves compromised by their relationships with the corporation she was reporting on, the pathway from documented evidence to institutional response was blocked at every stage. The story existed, the documentation was solid. The pathway that should have connected solid documentation to institutional consequence was simply not available. This is the particular exhaustion that investigative journalists covering regulatory capture tend to describe in ways that outsiders underestimate. The problem isn't journalism. The problem is that journalism functions as an accountability mechanism only insofar as other accountability mechanisms are available to act on its findings. When those other mechanisms are compromised, the journalism can be impeccable and still produce nothing, because it is the only part of a system that requires multiple parts to function. Alyssa understood this by the time she got out of Raccoon City. She published the article anyway, not because she was naive about its likely reception. 5 years of watching solid reporting fail to generate proportionate institutional response had removed any lingering naivety about the relationship between documented evidence and institutional action. She published it because some part of what journalism is, at its most fundamental, beneath the mechanisms of accountability that it ideally feeds, is the act of placing witness truth into the public record regardless of what the public does with it. A record that exists can be found later. A record that was never created cannot. This principle is the through line of Alyssa's professional life, and it connects directly to the 2016 story that most analyses of her lore pass over entirely. In 2016, a small Louisiana newspaper called the Dulvey Daily published an article by Alyssa Ashcroft examining mysterious disappearances in the town of Dulvey Parish over the preceding 2 years. The article established that these disappearances had become one of the only public accounts of a biological disaster occurring in the region. A subsequent cover-up and quarantine of the affected area ended any further public search for the missing persons. The dead were not formally listed as such. Players of Resident Evil 7 will recognize Dulvey Parish immediately. The Baker family plantation. The mold organism. Eveline. The biological horror that Ethan Winters walked into in 2017. 1 year after Alyssa published her article, was the fully developed consequence of whatever was happening in Dulvey Parish while she was writing about the disappearances. She was there first. She was in Dulvey Parish in 2016, almost 2 decades after Raccoon City, almost 2 decades after the outbreak and the article and the raccoon trials and the collapse of Umbrella USA. And she was writing about biological disappearances that a quarantine would cover up before the investigation could reach its conclusions. Different state, different corporation, or at least a different corporate vehicle, different organism, different victims, the same methodology, the same institutional response to the emergence of documentation, the same quarantine deployed to ensure that the evidence couldn't be assembled into a complete record by anyone who survived to tell what they'd found. The pattern did not die with Umbrella. Alyssa had been following the pattern, not the specific company. This is the insight that her full career, examined across its complete arc, makes visible. She wasn't a specialist in Umbrella. She was a specialist in the specific intersection of institutional biological research, community harm, and systematic evidence suppression that Umbrella had represented in the 1980s and 90s, and that other entities were representing in the 2000s and 2010s. She went to Dulvey because Dulvey fit the pattern she had spent 25 years learning to recognize. She published in a local newspaper with essentially no reach because the reach wasn't the point. The record was the point, placing documented testimony into the public archive. However small the archive, because the alternative, not creating the record, was the thing the institutions engineering these disasters were depending on. The quarantine that followed her Dulvey article suppressed it as effectively as the sterilization operation had suppressed the physical evidence of Raccoon City. Different mechanism, same function. The information was buried by institutional action that had the authority to declare certain locations and certain events off limits to public inquiry. But the article existed. Somewhere in the archive of the Dulvey Daily's published record, the article existed. And 2 years after Alyssa published it, something connected to everything she had been tracing across 25 years of work led her to a hotel. The pattern never stopped. and Alyssa never stopped following it. Chapter 8. The Renwood. The Renwood Hotel investigation in 2018 was the last investigation Alyssa Ashcroft ever worked. The lore record is deliberately sparse about the specifics of what she had found there. What the record tells us is the shape of the investigation, connected to whatever the institutional successor to the methodologies Umbrella had pioneered was now doing, in a location that was geographically and systematically positioned in ways that the pattern Alyssa had spent her career tracing would have made recognizable to her. She was investigating something at the Renwood. Whatever it was connected enough to ongoing institutional operations that someone made a decision about her. Not the decision to suppress her memories this time. Not the decision to manage her credibility from a distance. The decision that had been avoided in 1993, when Greg Miller had chosen suppression over elimination and inadvertently allowed a journalist to spend 5 more years building a documented record. The decision that Umbrella's institutional caution had always backed away from because of the accountability that dead journalists generate. Someone made that decision in 2018 at the Renwood Hotel. Alyssa Ashcroft was murdered by an unidentified, hooded assailant. She was killed in the middle of the investigation. In the middle of the work, her daughter Grace was there. Grace witnessed it. Consider the full weight of what that sentence contains, because the brevity of the lore record's description of this event should not be allowed to make it feel smaller than it is. Grace Ashcroft was present when the woman who had raised her, who had spent her entire life demonstrating through professional practice what it means to pursue the truth, even when the truth is dangerous, was killed for exactly that practice. Not despite the work, because of it. The investigation that Alyssa was running was connected enough to active institutional interests that the people with those interests decided finally that the accumulated decades of credibility management had run their course. The psychological implications of this for Grace are layered in ways that clinical literature on traumatic bereavement only partially accounts for. Complicated grief, the diagnostic category that describes mourning which is significantly disrupted by the nature, context, or circumstances of the loss, operates through different mechanisms than ordinary bereavement. When the loss involves witnessing, when it involves violence, when it involves the direct causal connection between the deceased's chosen work and the nature of their death, the grief interacts with identity formation in ways that extend far beyond standard mourning timelines. Grace grew up as Alyssa's daughter. That means she grew up adjacent to everything Alyssa knew: the Raccoon City testimony, the 5 years of reporting, the understanding of how institutional biological harm operates, and how the evidence of that harm gets managed. She grew up in a household where the conversation about corporations and cover-ups and the gap between what the world said happened and what actually happened was a professional constant. She had context that most people never develop even across entire careers of following these stories. The living context of having been raised by the woman who had been inside the event that defined the Resident Evil universe's relationship to institutional horror. Alyssa's murder at the Renwood gave all of that inherited context its most direct and personal form of confirmation. The institutional danger her mother had spent her life documenting and navigating was real enough to kill her. The pattern that Alyssa had followed from the Arklay Mountains to Dulvey Parish to the Renwood Hotel was real enough to produce a hooded assailant in a hotel corridor. The grief Grace carries from that night is not simply the grief of losing a parent. It is the grief of watching the thesis of your mother's life be proven correct in the worst possible way. The confirmation that everything Alyssa had said about how these institutions operate, about the lengths they will go to in order to protect their operations from documentation, was accurate. Because here was the evidence of it, standing in a hotel corridor, and here was the cost of it, being absorbed into Grace's body and her memory in a moment she will never stop carrying. After 2018, Grace Ashcroft joined the FBI. She built a career in technical analysis, not field investigation, not the kind of direct confrontational journalism her mother had practiced, but the careful, methodical examination of evidence, the building of documented conclusions from information rather than from the frontline exposure her mother had navigated. Her superior, Nathan Dempsey, regarded her as genuinely capable in the technical domain and largely without the field experience that frontline operational work demands. She carried what her mother had planted in the analytical skills she developed, in the specific knowledge of how institutional biological programs operate that no amount of FBI training could have provided, as efficiently as growing up in Alyssa Ashcroft's household. In the grief that had been shaping her professional choices since 2018, without her necessarily having named it as grief rather than purpose. And then, 8 years after her mother's death, the assignment arrived. The Renwood Hotel, unexplained infections and fatalities connected to a government office. The same hotel where Grace had watched Alyssa be killed, connected through an investigative trail that the record is still filling in, to something that required sending Grace Ashcroft, with her analytical skills and her absence of field experience and her entire inherited life, directly back to the place of the defining trauma of her life. And from there, the trail leads somewhere that anyone who has followed Alyssa's complete story will recognize immediately. The ruins of Raccoon City, sealed since October of 1998. Quarantined, declared the final resting place of everything the sterilization operation was deployed to bury. The physical location of the institutional horror that Alyssa Ashcroft spent her life trying to bring into public record, preserved under quarantine for 26 years in the specific condition of the most important piece of evidence that was never officially acknowledged as evidence. Something has opened it. Something is happening inside those ruins. And the woman being sent in to find out what is the daughter of the journalist who came closer than anyone to permanently dismantling the machinery that produced those ruins in the first place. Whether the people who sent Grace understand what they have sent, and whether that understanding was the point rather than an oversight, is the question that everything we've covered so far has been building toward. And the answer to that question is the most important thing in this final chapter. Chapter 9, Grace. There is a specific kind of person who becomes a technical analyst at a federal agency after watching their parent be murdered in a hotel corridor. Not the kind who retreats entirely from the work that got their parent killed, because retreat would require pretending that the work was the problem, and Grace Ashcroft grew up understanding at a cellular level that the work was the only honest response to the problem, and not the kind who charges directly into field operations driven by grief-fueled aggression, because that requires a certain relationship to one's own invulnerability that witnessing violence at close range tends to permanently revise. What it produces, more often, is the kind of person who builds a fortified interior, who channels the inheritance into technical mastery, into the careful examination of evidence from behind the protective distance that analysis provides, into becoming extremely good at understanding how things work without having to stand directly in front of them while they're happening. Grace Ashcroft, by the time the Renwood Hotel assignment arrived, had spent 8 years becoming that person, quietly skilled, technically capable in ways her superior Nathan Dempsey acknowledged directly, carrying beneath the professional competence the specific emotional weight of someone who knows exactly why the work matters, in ways that most of her colleagues have only read about in briefing documents and institutional histories. Her superior regarded her as someone without significant field experience. That assessment was accurate as a professional evaluation. as a description of what Grace actually carried into operational environments, it was incomplete in ways that would only become visible once she was inside them. Because field experience, in the conventional sense, is about the body's learned responses to physical danger, the trained automaticity that allows operators to function under acute crisis, conditions without burning through cognitive resources on fear management. Grace didn't have that. What she had was something that conventional field experience rarely provides: a comprehensive, lived proximity understanding of the specific institutional machinery she was being sent to investigate. She had grown up inside the secondary exposure of her mother's work. Every conversation at every dinner table about the pattern. Every time Alyssa explained how these institutions embed themselves, how they manage evidence, how they identify and neutralize the people who come close to full documentation. Every story Alyssa came home carrying from whatever edge she had been working that week. Grace absorbed all of it, not as training, as living, as the texture of ordinary childhood filtered through a mother whose professional world was the hidden infrastructure of institutional biological horror. The assignment to the Renwood hotel case carried a quality that the record hints at without fully elaborating. Nathan Dempsey knew where Alyssa had died, sending Grace back to the site of her mother's murder. A field assignment for an analyst without field experience to a location with maximal personal trauma loading was a decision that someone made deliberately. Whether that deliberateness represents institutional callousness, a calculated assessment that Grace's specific background made her the right person for this specific investigation, or something more troubling about who benefits from sending Alyssa Ashcroft's daughter into the ruins of Raccoon City, is a question the record leaves open with the particular deliberateness of lore that intends its ambiguity as a feature. What happens when Grace arrives at the Renwood is the beginning of Resident Evil Requiem's active narrative. The investigation into unexplained infections and fatalities connected to a government office pulls at threads that, followed backward through the institutional landscape, converge on the same geography they have always converged on when the pattern Alyssa documented is operating. The trail leads to Raccoon City's ruins. Leon Scott Kennedy is there. The presence of Leon Scott Kennedy in this story, alongside Grace Ashcroft, is not incidental. Leon was inside Raccoon City during the outbreak. He was a rookie officer with the Raccoon Police Department, newly arrived, present for the events of Resident Evil 2, the city's final days of visible functioning before the sterilization operation ended them. He survived as a direct participant, as someone whose body carries the physical memory of moving through those streets while they were actively dying around him. He has spent the decades since working at the intersection of government and biological horror in ways that have made him one of the few people alive with both the field capability and the institutional context to navigate whatever is currently operating in those ruins. Leon and Grace represent two different inheritances from Raccoon City. His is direct. He was there, he survived, he carries it as personal history and professional specialization. Hers is mediated. She inherits it through her mother's documentation of the events that preceded and produced the outbreak, through the testimony Alyssa spent her career assembling, through the grief of what that documentation eventually cost. Together, these two people constitute something like the complete account: the person who was inside the event and the person who inherited the record of the event's origins, the survivor and the archivist's daughter. Victor Gideon is the primary antagonist. The record names him without fully detailing the scope of his operation, which is consistent with the practice of lore documentation that releases pieces of the puzzle in the sequence the narrative controls, rather than the sequence that would make immediate comprehensive sense. What the record establishes is that whatever Gideon is doing inside, or connected to the ruins of Raccoon City, is generating the same signature of institutional biological harm that Alyssa's complete career had been tracing. Infections connected to a government office, fatalities that produce quarantine rather than investigation, the institutional reflex to seal rather than to expose, the same reflex that produced the sterilization operation in 1998, the same reflex that quarantined Dulvey Parish after Alyssa's article in 2016, the same reflex that got Alyssa killed at the Renwood rather than simply discredited one more time. The ruins of Raccoon City have been sealed for 26 years. Consider what that means as a physical space. A city that was home to 100,000 people, destroyed by government action in October of 1998, quarantined and classified, and kept outside the reach of public investigation for over a quarter century. The buildings are still there. The infrastructure is still there. The research facilities and the underground networks and the physical evidence of everything that was happening inside that city before the missiles came are still there, preserved inside the quarantine like biological material inside a containment vessel, protected from examination by the same institutional authority that authorized the destruction. Umbrella's physical legacy is inside those ruins. The documented record of the experiments, the facilities, the connections between the Arklay Mountain Research Network and the urban infrastructure it contaminated, all of it frozen in the moment of the city's destruction, kept behind walls that the government has been maintaining for 26 years without publicly explaining what the walls are protecting. Someone has found a reason to reopen that space, or someone has found that someone else already reopened it, and that whatever is currently operating inside those ruins has been using the quarantine as its own form of institutional protection, the same cover that isolated research facilities have always used, the same guarantee of privacy that the Arklay Hospital had in 1993, that Sinyala had in the Arizona desert in 1959, that every facility operating at the edge of what human ethics permits has always sought in geographical or institutional isolation. The quarantine designed to bury the evidence has become the protection under which the next iteration of the same methodology is operating. This is the moment where everything Alyssa spent her life documenting arrives at its most complete and terrible form. She wasn't just following Umbrella. She was following the principle that Umbrella represented, that institutional biological research conducted outside of genuine accountability generates catastrophic harm, that the mechanisms used to suppress that harm become the infrastructure that enables the next iteration of it, that cover-ups don't end stories but create the protected spaces in which new versions of the same story begin. The ruins of Raccoon City are that protected space, and Grace Ashcroft is walking into them carrying something that no other investigator being sent into those ruins would carry. Not just FBI credentials and technical training, not just the specific analytical capabilities that 8 years of deliberate professional development produced. She carries the complete documented testimony of her mother's 25-year investigation. She carries the knowledge, transmitted through years of proximity to Alyssa's work, of how this specific pattern of institutional harm operates and what it looks like in its active phase. She carries the understanding, inherited rather than trained, grown into rather than studied, that the methodology doesn't die with the corporation, that it relocates, that it finds new vehicles and new protected spaces and new populations to conduct its research on, and that the only thing that has ever functioned as sustained resistance to it is exactly the kind of careful, persistent, record-building documentation that her mother practiced until the day it got her killed. She carries all of that into the ruins, and she carries it inside a psychology that her superior described as timid. This is the part of Grace's characterization that demands more careful attention than the shorthand of field experience versus technical skill provides. Shyness and timidity are real features of her documented presentation. The record is clear about this, and there is no interpretive payoff in simply reversing it into hidden strength or courage disguised as fear. Grace is genuinely frightened. She approaches the world from a position of emotional vulnerability that the specific shape of her childhood and her defining trauma has produced. She has built around that vulnerability a sophisticated technical competence that allows her to function effectively at the analytical distance her work usually requires. What the Renwood assignment removes is that distance. She is not being asked to analyze from behind the protective glass of institutional remove. She is being put into the field, into the location of her mother's murder, connected to the ruins of the city that represents the culmination of everything Alyssa documented, without the field experience that produces the trained body knowledge of how to function in physical danger. She is being asked to do the thing she is most personally frightened of doing, in the place she is most personally frightened of going, with the highest possible personal stakes attached to whatever she finds there. The clinical literature on post-traumatic growth, the documented phenomenon whereby individuals who have moved through traumatic experience in particular ways develop specific capacities that weren't available to them before the trauma, describes a pattern that is distinct from simple resilience. Resilience is bouncing back to a prior level of function. Post-traumatic growth is the development of something new in the specific space that the trauma opened. People who experience it often describe a sharpened sense of what matters, a clarified relationship to purpose, a capacity for tolerating uncertainty and fear that the pre-trauma self didn't possess. Not because the fear is gone, but because the experience of surviving what the fear warned against has recalibrated the relationship between the feeling and the function. Grace has had 8 years to process the trauma of watching her mother die. 8 years of analytical work that from one angle looks like professional development and from another looks like the careful construction of a self that can handle being in proximity to the institutional horror she inherited without being destroyed by that proximity. Whether that construction will hold when the proximity becomes physical, when she is not analyzing data about what happened in Raccoon City, but standing inside the ruins of it, is the central question of her story. The answer, in narrative terms, will come from Resident Evil Requiem. The game is the continuation of everything Alyssa planted. But the answer, in the terms that Alyssa's entire story has been building toward, is already present in the fact of Grace's existence. Alyssa spent 25 years placing records into the archive despite institutional suppression that dwarfed anything she could personally withstand. She did not overcome that suppression. She did not live to see the full accountability that her work was demanding. She died at the Renwood in the middle of an investigation that wasn't finished. The institution she had been fighting had not been defeated, but the record existed. The documented testimony of 5 years of circumferential reporting connected to recovered memories, connected to 72 hours of outbreak survival, connected to the Raccoon trials, connected to the Dulve article, connected to the Renwood Hotel investigation. All of it placed into the archive by a woman who understood that the record itself, regardless of what the world currently does with it, is the most durable form of resistance available to someone without institutional power. And the record produced Grace, not as a comfortable inheritance, not as a triumphant conclusion to a story of institutional accountability finally working the way it was supposed to. Grace is timid and technically skilled, and being sent into a place she is deeply afraid of by institutional actors whose motives the record leaves productively unclear. She is, in almost every external sense, exactly the wrong person to be walking into Raccoon City's ruins in pursuit of Victor Gideon. She is a first-time field operative with maximal personal trauma loading and no prepared body knowledge of the physical danger she is being placed inside. What she is, in the one sense that matters most, in the context of everything her mother built, is prepared. Prepared in the specific way that proximity to truth-telling produces, in the people who grow up adjacent to it, with an understanding of how the machinery works and what it looks like when it's running, and what the institutional language for it sounds like when the institution is managing the evidence of its own harm. She can read what she's walking into in a way that is not the product of operational training, but of 20 years of living in the intellectual and emotional proximity of the woman who read it first. Alyssa taught her, not through formal instruction, but through the accumulated testimony of a life spent watching, that the most dangerous thing any of these institutions fears is a thorough and persistent record, not a confrontation, not an armed response, not a legal proceeding, though legal proceedings matter. A record, documented, placed into the archive, connecting the dots between what happened here and what happened there and what the pattern looks like when you trace it across enough geography and enough time to see its full shape. Grace is walking into Raccoon City's ruins with exactly that understanding. She knows what to look for. She knows how institutional evidence management works and what it does to the spaces it's been protecting. She knows that whatever Victor Gideon has been operating inside those quarantined walls has been using the same cover that every previous iteration of this methodology has used: isolation, classification, the institutional authority to declare certain spaces and certain events off limits to the public record. Alyssa spent her life trying to breach exactly those spaces and declare exactly those events into the public record. Her daughter is about to walk into the most protected of all of them. Chapter 10. What She Left Behind. The full shape of Alyssa Ashcroft's story, traced from beginning to end, is not a story about a survivor. Survivor is too small a category for what she actually was. She survived Raccoon City. Yes, and the survival was real, and the courage it required was real, and the specific cognitive and professional capabilities she brought to those 72 hours were genuinely what allowed her to come out the other side carrying the documentation she needed to carry. All of that matters, but survival was instrumental to something larger. Alyssa survived Raccoon City because the story needed a witness who would still be standing after the city was destroyed. Someone who had been inside both the beginning and the end of the institutional horror that produced the outbreak. Someone whose testimony could not be fully erased because it existed in a body that was still alive, and a mind that was still functional, and a professional instinct that was still running even under conditions designed to make professional instincts feel irrelevant. She was the record that Umbrella's sterilization operation couldn't reach. Think of the full span of it. 1993 to 2018. 25 years of a single person maintaining the evidentiary thread of an institutional horror story that was constantly working to be forgotten. The memory suppression. The 5 years of circumferential journalism that circled the story without being able to reach its center. The Raccoon City outbreak and the recovered memories inside the hospital where it had all begun. The article that was dismissed. The Raccoon trials that produced partial accountability without full public reckoning. The decade and more of continued work. The Dolvay article in a local newspaper that almost nobody read. The Renwood Hotel. At every stage, the institution had more resources than she did. At every stage, the institutional capacity for suppression and credibility management and narrative control was larger than her individual capacity for documentation and publication. At every stage, a reasonable assessment of the power differential would have produced the conclusion that continuing was futile, that the record she was building would be managed out of public awareness as effectively as the record she had already built had been managed, that the cost of continuing was not proportionate to what the continuation could realistically achieve. She continued anyway, Not because she was invulnerable to the costs. The record makes clear that she was not, that the institutional pressures worked on her the way they work on everyone who attempts sustained documentation of institutional harm, but because the alternative, stopping, required accepting the institutional position that the events she had witnessed should be allowed to remain unrecorded, and that acceptance was the one thing she couldn't make herself perform. The Dulvey article is the most instructive piece of evidence for this reading of Alyssa. It was published in a local Louisiana newspaper. It documented disappearances in a town most people had never heard of. It was buried by a quarantine within a time frame that ensured almost no one would read it, connect it to the broader pattern, and act on it. By every conventional measure of what journalism is supposed to accomplish: public attention, institutional response, policy change, it accomplished essentially nothing. She published it anyway, in the Dulvey Daily, in a town called Dulvey Parish, because the people who had disappeared deserved a public record of their disappearance, because the pattern she was documenting had produced another instance that needed to be placed into the archive, because a record that exists, however buried, is not the same as a record that was never created. This is the principle that Grace has inherited, not the professional invincibility that it might look like. From outside, Alyssa was not invincible, and the Renwood Hotel proved it with terrible finality. What Grace has inherited is the understanding that the record is itself the act of resistance, that documentation conducted with care and persistence, and the willingness to publish in whatever venue is available, regardless of what the institutional response will be, is the specific form of engagement with power that cannot be fully defeated as long as the person practicing it is alive. Grace is alive. She is in the ruins of Raccoon City with Leon Scott Kennedy and the full weight of everything her mother spent 25 years trying to place into the record. Victor Gideon is operating inside those ruins with the protection of a quarantine that has held for 26 years. Something is growing in the sealed spaces of the city that was destroyed to make sure it could never be documented. Alyssa planted seeds in salted ground for 25 years. Something has been growing. What Alyssa Ashcroft was, beneath the survivor narrative, beneath the playable character framework, beneath the lore entry on a wiki page, was a witness who refused to stop witnessing. The institution that tried to suppress her memories in 1993 inadvertently produced a 5-year evidentiary record. The institution that tried to discredit her article after Raccoon City inadvertently produced a journalist who kept following the pattern past the corporate collapse that was supposed to end the story. The institution that finally had her killed at the Renwood Hotel inadvertently produced Grace. The quarantine around Raccoon City has held for 26 years. Grace is inside it now. Whatever was buried there when the city was destroyed in 1998, whatever Victor Gideon has been doing in the protected silence of those ruins, is about to be documented by the daughter of the woman who spent her life ensuring that things like this get documented. Alyssa didn't get to finish, but perhaps Grace will.